Welcome to the Story Nerd Podcast, Hook Your Reader episode. This is where we give authors our professional advice about their query letters and their first 10 pages writing samples. I'm Kathleen Fox, and I'm a literary agent with the Rights Factory in Toronto and a freelance editor at Fox Editorial.
And I am Valerie Francis. I am an author and a story editor, and I teach writers how to craft a book so good that it hooks a reader on page one and never lets them go.
On today's episode, we're reviewing a police procedural story from Charles Pringle. A quick note to our listeners, please be advised of a content warning. There is talk of suicide in the query letter and in our discussions today. Before we get started, we'd love it if you could help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and a review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It is that simple. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Alrighty, I will get started by reading the query letter. But before I do that, just a quick reminder that if you want to read the query letters and the first 10 pages writing samples that we review here on the show, all you have to do is sign up to my mailing list. And you can do that by going to valeriefrancis.ca/checklist and download the first 10 pages checklist. All right, here we go with Charles's query letter. Dear Valerie, I am writing to submit the first 10 pages of my novel, 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. It is a police procedural set in Japan and is the third in a series featuring Akira Toyota of the Foreign Crimes Division of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Force. The novel is just over 160,000 words long. When 4 loyal salarymen, the so-called samurai of the post-war revival in Japan, are made redundant, they decide to commit collective and simultaneous suicide. At the last moment, they change their minds and decide to embark on a campaign of revenge against society. A series of seemingly unconnected brutal incidents, murder of 3 teenage thugs in a park, the extortion and murder of corrupt bureaucrats, the public killing of 2 Filipino seamen in Yokohama, a violent gang war between the rival Yazuka groups, and bomb attacks on Japanese multinationals that seem to bear the signature of a former IRA bomb maker, shake Japan society and perplex the police until Chief Inspector Akira Toyota takes charge of the hunt for the bombers. Using his experience and connections in the anti-terrorism branch of the London Metropolitan Police, he tracks down the perpetrators, and this leads to a thrilling but deadly finale in central Tokyo. Thank you for reading my cover letter and the sample pages. I eagerly await your feedback. Warm regards, Charles Pringle. Okay, Kathleen, you get started. What do you think of Charles's query letter?
For me, when I first opened it, the query letter immediately looked too small. So then I started wondering, I wonder if there's going to be enough detail here. And as it turns out, more information is needed. And in the opening paragraph, so one thing that I noticed is missing is we don't have any comp titles. So I have talked about those a lot before. Those are basically a couple of titles that show the intersection of the most prominent themes or elements in your novel. Something that's more kind of sales and marketing, so that just helps a publisher with, an agent with feeling the vibe of the story they're about to read about. And it's showing, if you're picking a couple of books that sold well in the last 2 years, up to 5 years max, then it's showing a publisher that, this is, if it's like this book and that one sold well, this one might as well. So comps are really important. And I'm also quite concerned about the word count. So 160,000 words is roughly double the size this should be if you're looking for traditional publishing. If this had landed in my inbox, I would not have gotten to the pages, unfortunately, because I just know that 160,000 words is much too long for traditional publishers. So that means that it's going to need a lot of work, and that the amount of work that is required falls outside the scope of what an agent does. So even if I loved the concept and the query was really, really compelling, I wouldn't want to fall in love with the pages. Because I just know it has to be pared down a lot. And agents know that a traditional publisher won't consider a high word count at all unless the author is, already well established. They have books that are, a little bit bigger, and they've sold well. So, and in that case, if there were previously published books and especially if they did sell well, that should be in the query letter as well to let the agent know. Um, this is a bit of a touchy subject, but I do feel it's important to bring up. And this is within the traditional publishing landscape. As soon as I started reading the plot paragraphs, I wondered if there was a possible cultural appropriation thing happening. And I'm, of course, only basing this off of what I know from the query letter. It seems that the protagonists and antagonists are Japanese, and it takes place in Japan. And your name suggests that you probably aren't of Japanese descent, and I could be completely wrong about that. So I apologize if that's the case. But my point is that if you are Japanese, it doesn't say so in the query letter. So now I'm wondering if there is, some cultural appropriation happening. In the current publishing landscape, there's a big push to make room at the table for everyone to tell their own stories. So when a presumably white person is writing from the perspective of someone that is of a different cultural background, religious background, etc., um, it can present an issue, quite likely a lack of authenticity, because when a white person can't possibly know what it's like to be in the shoes of a Japanese person or, of any other culture. Um, it would be the same as, if a black person were to write about someone who is Japanese or from South America, or a non-disabled person writing from the perspective of a person with a physical disability, for example, a neurotypical author writing a neurodivergent POV character. So we want to have diversity in stories, but writing from the perspective, so having a POV character, that's where it gets a little tricky. Um, Writing from inside the mind and heart of a character who is of a different culture or society or religion, etc., than the author. Um, it 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 can open up the door to perpetuate stereotypes and potentially harmful views, even when that's not the author's intention. So many publishers and agents are looking for stories with BIPOC characters written by BIPOC authors, because those are their stories to tell. So, of course, um, if the author is Japanese, I would say so in the query letter so that the agent gets, they can understand that it is written from a place of authenticity. So yeah, it's a tricky subject. Not everybody will agree. You don't have to agree, you don't have to like it, but that is kind of where we're at with the traditional publishing landscape in today's market. I also wondered how feasible or realistic it would be to have not just one, but all four of these loyal salarymen deciding that they're going to commit suicide. That's an awful big decision to make, and then to back out, and then all of a sudden go out and just start committing crimes. If they're all losing their jobs or whatnot, like there seems to be something missing there. Like that doesn't seem like the natural course to go unless there's a reason for it. And that's a very personal thing. So just to have all four of them just decide that's what they're going to do, it seemed off to me. And I think Akira is the protagonist. That's my guess. Um, but we don't meet him until the end of the plot paragraph. So I'm not sure if I'm incorrect about him being the protagonist or if this is maybe the story of these four loyal salarymen. But in the opening paragraph with the metadata, it sounded like Akira was the protagonist, and that would kind of match the genre that it's being pitched in. And I also wanted to know more about who Akira is, what his norm is before he's thrown into this case, what kind of person he is, what matters to him, what his goal is, what's at stake. The tension is missing here for me, and that's because we don't have enough details about what's actually happening and why it's happening, from the perspective of the protagonist. So those are my main thoughts. How about you, Valerie?
I just want to pause for a minute on the topic of cultural appropriation, because I mean, we can debate it, and there's really great arguments to be made on both sides of the debate. As as a writer, as an artist, I if I'm just purely in the creative mindset, I can argue that, well, if there's a story I want to tell, I should be able to tell it. And and yeah, we can write whatever story we want. There's no one saying we can't write a particular story. But if you want to be published in traditional publishing right now, today, in, like you said, the current publishing landscape, you got to be prepared to play the game. And you don't have to like the game. You can decide, no, I'm going to indie publish this because I believe in my story. And that's all there is to it. Great. Absolutely. Indie publishing is an absolutely viable business model for a lot of writers for a lot of different reasons. Um, i- so you don't have to like it, but you do have to accept that that's how it is at the moment. So know the know the rules of the game you're playing and understand that the rules of the game are constantly changing, and there's nothing you can do about that either. There's nothing I can do about it either. You just have to decide, I'm going to be in it or I'm not going to be in it. Um, Another thing I wanted to just talk about of the length, as an editor, 160,000 words would have been a red flag for me as well, because it is such a huge edit. And it's actually very challenging to write a tight novel that's 70 or 80 or 90,000 words. It's more challenging, believe it or not, from my perspective and just the experience I've had now of this last 10, 11 years working with writers. It's more challenging than writing a huge manuscript, of 160,000 words. So, the word count is, to me, definitely the first thing you need to look at. Now that said, I really like police procedurals, so that's exciting to me, and I love stories that are set in different settings. Nothing against books set in American landscapes, but I have read so many of them that any other setting, even a Canadian setting, is refreshing. And Louise Penny, who is a Canadian mystery writer, she, I think, is now on her 20-something book with Inspector Gamache. And she said she had a really hard time publishing her very first book because it's set in Quebec, in Canada. And at the time, publishers and agents were telling her, no one wants to read a book set in Canada. You have to set your book in the US. Now, that was quite a few years ago, 20 years ago. That is changing. So all those years ago, that was the rules of the game for Louise Penny, the publishing game. But that has changed now, and stories that are set in other locations are they're wonderful. They're refreshing. That's the best word I can come up with, is refreshing. Um, okay, so I do have a couple of questions, Kathleen. I don't hope I'm not putting you on the spot with any of these, but listen, I got you here, so I'm just going to ask them. So Charles is querying the third book in a series. Um, that raised an eyebrow for me because I then had a bunch of questions. Well, why the third? What happened to the first two? Has he been published before? If so, how? Indie published, or did he have a traditional deal? Did he have an agent before? Like, has he been previously represented? Now, maybe he's using the third book in a series because, this is a really great opportunity to have you review someone's query letter and to have us both review the 10 pages. And maybe this is just the book he's working on. So for the sake of the podcast here, he just sent it in, or, which is great. No problem with that at all, as far as I'm concerned. But if this were a real query situation, as an agent, what would your thought be on receiving a query for a book that's like third in a series? Is that a big deal? Is it okay?
Um, it can be tricky. So it will depend on what the sales were of the other books. And especially in the US. The US is very concerned with those sales numbers. Um, I have noticed not a lot. I've noticed kind of a change, I guess, in how books are being acquired, and I've noticed that in deal announcements, it's a previously self-published author. This is the author's, fourth book or whatnot. and they've also purchased the books in the author's backlist. So now they will be republished by a traditional publisher. This is not the norm. It is more challenging to have something like that happen. Um, but like it's a very individual thing. So I can't really put a blanket statement on it because it's going to depend on a few different things. Like what is the writing like? What is the story like in this particular book? Because that comes first. If this is the one that you're querying me with, I have to fall in love with this particular story. And then we could talk about whether or not the other two come into play. And also, like, is this a standalone, or like, do you have to read the other ones first before this one? Because that makes it even more challenging, right? So there's all kinds of things that we look at, but it's never like a definitive no for every single one. It just depends. It's very individual.
Okay. That's a surprising answer, but okay. Great. That's good information to have. All right. With the plot paragraphs, Charles, um, there is a way of writing the plot paragraphs that hook a reader. Now, a lot of writers have trouble with this. They struggle with it, and I get it. It took me 11 years to figure out how to write these plot paragraphs, but I mean, you can learn it in an hour. There is no guesswork here. It's not magic. What it is pure story theory. Another reason I love story theory. And it's really simple once you know how. I explain it all in the hook formula, which you can use to develop your one sentence pitch or the plot paragraphs here in a query letter. Or if you are an indie author, you can use the hook formula to craft your back cover blurb. So if anyone wants to know more about that, you can go to storynerd.ca and click the courses button at the top of the page. In the meantime, Charles, let me give you a bit of practical feedback that you can start working on right away. From this query letter, my understanding is that the main character is Chief Inspector Akira Toyota. So, write the plot paragraphs from his perspective. This is a police procedural, so the plot, therefore, is about the challenges that Toyota has in bringing the criminals to justice. So, tell me about that, because as a reader, when I see a police procedural, the reason I'm going to buy it and pick it up and read it is because that's the story I want to hear. That's the story I want to read. The inspector investigating the case, finding out who did it, and bringing them to justice. So, in your plot paragraph bit in the query letter, that's what you would be talking about. You would be letting the reader know how formidable these antagonists are, like exactly what is it that Toyota is up against here, and how is he coping. Um, I have another question, Kathleen, and it's not specifically related to Charles's query letter. But like I said, I got you here, and it's something I've wondered about, so I'm going to ask it. And the question is about comp titles. All right, you said in past episodes, and you said it already in this episode, that um, when you're doing comp titles, films and TV shows are fine, but writers also need to use books as comps because, after all, we're trying to sell a book to a publisher. And the book needs to be published in the last 3 to 5 years or so. Okay, so far, so good. But even though agents are avid readers, it is still entirely possible that an author will use a comp title that the agent has never heard of. So my question is, what does an agent do in that situation? Do you just skip over it and maybe go back and research the comp titles if the plot paragraphs and the opening pages are of interest? And if you're thinking about asking for a full manuscript, do you stop right away and look them up? I can't imagine you do that. But how do you handle that when you've never heard of the comp titles that they're proposing?
Yeah, that again, it differs because that does happen all the time. We can't possibly read all the books. um, so like if it's a title that I've heard of, maybe I've heard of it and I'm like, yeah, I haven't read it yet and I really, really want to. That kind of gives me an idea. But if it's something that I haven't heard of before, um, I don't know. It just depends on how I'm feeling in that second when I'm reading the query. Like sometimes I'll go ahead and read the plot paragraphs, and then if I'm like, "Ooh, this sounds good," then I'll go and check out the comp titles. And sometimes if there's just something catchy in that first little bit in the metadata, or the way that they describe what elements they're comparing to in these titles, then sometimes I'll take a few seconds and go to Amazon just to get an idea, right? Then I can look at the back cover copy and get an idea. But yeah, it just depends on where I'm at in the moment in each query letter.
Okay. Yeah, your whole query inbox overwhelms me, and I don't even have to look at it.
Me too.
Just the idea of it overwhelms me.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into the sample pages then. I'll start. So, Charles, I'm going to focus on 3 macro storytelling principles, and those are prologues, point of view, and specificity. Thank you for including a prologue because it gives us an opportunity to discuss prologues because this comes up all the time. All right, so the first page starts with quote, chapter 1 dash prologue. So the first thing I want to say is a prologue is a passage that actually comes before chapter 1. They're not the same thing. But having read this, I think I know why Charles maybe labeled it that way. The book opens with about a page and a third describing a gang attack on a boy, and then there's a break in the text, and then the narrative switches to the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. So I'm assuming that Charles is thinking that the gang attack is the prologue, and then everything after the break, the bit in the newsroom, is the start of chapter 1. Um, I I think the whole thing is probably a prologue, but I'm not sure. Either way, it gives us a great example to talk about prologues. I don't know about you, Kathleen, but I get a lot of questions about prologues. Now, hooking a reader in the first 10 pages can be a challenge. There's a bit of a trick to it. I'm not going to lie. And prologues make it even harder because what you're doing is effectively creating 2 beginnings. So you have to hook your reader twice, which means you're making your job twice as hard as it needs to be. Why do that? I don't know. So when writers want to use a prologue at the beginning of the stories, the first thing that I do is ask them why. Like, what purpose does it serve? How does it make the story better or more compelling? Because everything that you put on the page must be in service of the main story. Prologues are really hard to do well. And for the most part, they detract from the main stories. There's a lot of writing traps that you can easily fall into with prologues. And I think chief among them is that writers tend to use the prologue as a place to dump a whole bunch of backstory. And that actually makes the whole book weaker. Another reason people tell me that they've used a prologue is because they've seen it in other books and they think that that's just what they're supposed to do. So they don't even know why they're putting in a prologue. They're not even entirely sure what the prologue, what the function of it is, but they've just seen it in other books and so they're replicating it. With all the clients that I have worked with over the years, only once have I ever recommended that a writer use a prologue, but in that case, it was a prologue and an epilogue. And that was for a memoir. Even then, my advice to the author was to keep both of them really short and focused. And it was because, given the topic of her memoir, understanding the context and understanding what was going on in society at that particular time was really important. So in those cases, the prologue and the epilogue were enriching the main story, but that's the only time I've ever recommended it. Now, I'm not saying that prologues are bad and writers should never ever use them. None of the storytelling principles are good and none of them are bad. They are what they are, and our job is to understand what they do well and what they don't do so well so that we know how to use them or not use them, as the case may be, to write the most compelling story possible. My advice would be to everybody and to myself as a writer as well. The editor me advises the writer me of this exact thing. And that is, unless you're a highly skilled writer, why make your job more difficult than it needs to be? This is hard enough. I am not into creating obstacles just for the fun of it. It's just I'm not going to do it. And Charles, since you have such a long manuscript and you basically need to cut it in half, since none of the stuff that's going on in this particular part of the book has to do with the main plot line, or at least I'm assuming that, that's my assumption based on the query letter, that paragraph in the query letter. Maybe it can all go. Or maybe it's that Charles has perhaps started the book in the wrong place. I mean, I don't know for sure because I haven't read the whole manuscript, but suffice it to say that what's in the query letter and what's in the opening pages, for me, aren't lining up. Yes, the four horsemen feature in both the query letter and the opening pages. But are the attacks that are happening there the same ones that are in the query letter? I'm not sure. From the query letter, it seems that the global inciting incident is the murder of the 3 teenage thugs in a park. So I'm not sure if that's the massacre in the park mentioned on page 2. If it is, then you could open the story with the chief inspector arriving at this crime scene. If it isn't, then honestly delete it all and start the book with the murder of the 3 thugs, which presumably is coming up very soon in the opening chapters. If it is later than chapter 5, or better yet, later, by chapter 3, then it's too deep into the story. It's way too deep into the story. You got to get your book moving really, really fast. All right, so that brings me to my second point, which is point of view. So Charles has chosen third-person omniscient. Now, again, none of the storytelling principles are good. None of them are bad. We just have to know what they do well and not so well so we can use them to the greatest effect. Third-person omniscient is really common, super common, but it's also super challenging because writers tend to write in a style that is too far removed from the action or from the main character. And when that happens, creating an emotional connection with the main character, which is a must for us, is really challenging. I mean, again, it's putting another obstacle in your way. And I'm all about removing the obstacles, frankly. So if you are committed to third-person omniscient, if that's the style you like to write in and you think it's important for the story, you absolutely can keep writing in third-person omniscient. No problem with that. But bring the narrative perspective as close as possible to the point of view character. Now, another thing that makes third-person omniscient challenging is that the narrator knows everything, right? And because the narrator knows everything, it's tempting for you, the writer, to have the narrator tell the reader everything. If they know everything, they say everything. So we as the reader know what everyone is thinking and everyone is feeling at any given moment. And what that does is drain a story of tension really quickly, when what we want to do is create and hold tension as long as possible. So a reader is on a need-to-know basis. You don't tell them anything that they don't need to know. Only tell them what they need to know and only when they need to know it. What third-person omniscient does, or it usually does, is create multiple point of view characters, and that may or may not also mean that there are multiple plot lines. All right. In a multi-point of view, multi-plot line story, they're also more difficult to write. So this is like the third obstacle in your way. They're so difficult to write that very often they fall apart very quickly because you got to keep a lot of plates spinning, and all of these plot lines have to work with each other. You will still have a main plot line, which is the inspector inspecting these crimes, investigating these crimes, and finding out who did it and bring them to justice. That's your main storyline. Any other storyline that you have here exists to enhance that main storyline, to complicate it in some way, to reveal something about a character in some way. The way you complicate the main plot is limited only by your imagination. It just needs to enhance that main plot somehow. Now, coming up in season 19 on the Story Nerd podcast, Melanie and I go into 2 or maybe 3, I can't remember, examples where it's a multi-plot, multi-POV film, and they fall apart. They really fall apart. Now, in a film, you've got 2 hours-ish. So you got to pack a lot into that 2 hours. Well, in a novel, you still have 80, 90,000 words. And you got to pack a lot into that. And the more storylines you have and the more point of view characters you have, the harder it becomes to write a coherent story, the harder it becomes to create empathy with the main character, the harder it becomes to create and hold tension in your story. It just the degree of writing difficulty just goes through the roof so fast that it's unbelievable. In the first 10 pages, we meet the 4 antagonists, but the protagonist, who is Chief Inspector Akira Toyota, he doesn't make an appearance at all. So what's happening here is, because we're meeting the antagonists first, and we're seeing them as little boys, and we're seeing them lose their jobs, and we're seeing them lose all hope for the future, Charles, what you're doing here is running the risk of having the reader empathize with the antagonists, and that's dangerous territory. If a reader empathizes with the 4 horsemen before the main character even walks on stage, here's what's going to happen. The reader will see the protagonist as the antagonist, and the antagonists as vigilante type antiheroes. And since you've identified this as a police procedural, if empathy is with the villains instead of the chief inspector, your story's in trouble. So, what's the solution? Well, there are a couple of things that need to happen. First, my recommendation would be to have the reader meet the chief inspector first, like immediately. Page 1 would be great. Show us what he's up against. He has to find out who committed the murders in the park and bring them to justice. That's what happens in a police procedural, right? So the question is, how difficult is that job for him? Now, honestly, I know nothing about the police force in Japan, so I do not know if what I'm about to say is applicable to them or not, but these are just examples to illustrate my point. All right, so for example, if there are budgetary concerns, which mean that the chief inspector can't get anyone to work overtime, and that means test results are taking forever, or that he can't get a surveillance team or equipment, like, these are complications, right? This is something that he's up against. Maybe there's a particular political pressure that he's under to solve these crimes quickly. I don't know. Maybe the victim is the child of someone who's really important, and then there's lots of pressure to find who done it. Or maybe the victim is someone who's really important, maybe a political figure or a celebrity or someone that makes this case really high profile. Does the chief inspector have any personal problems that would interfere with his ability to do the job, or that would distract him from doing the job, or make him overlook an important clue, or make him biased towards someone or against someone? Right? That's interesting stuff. That is fertile storytelling ground. Something else that you could do is not include the antagonist's point of view. You can still write in third person omniscient, but stay with the chief inspector. Because if we are seeing the antagonist's point of view, a couple of things are going to happen, other than you're creating now a multi-plot, multi-POV view. Oh my goodness. Multi-plot, multi-POV story, which is, as I said, tough just makes the writing of it tougher. But you're going to create empathy for them, which is trouble. That is trouble in River City. And you're going to create a situation known as dramatic irony. And this means that the reader knows more than the protagonist. And that doesn't work in a police procedural. You need what's called mystery, which means the chief inspector, as the main character, knows more than the reader. He's got to be smarter than the reader. That's why we're reading these types of books. Yes, it's for the procedure of the police work, but it's also because we want the chief inspector to solve the crime before us. Like, we want him to wow us with his crime-solving ability. That's one of the reasons we love these types of books. Okay, so that brings me to my third topic, which is specificity. Now, as the opening pages stand right now, we don't get any specific character at all until page 6, which is really deep into the opening pages. The first 5 pages detail several extremely violent attacks, but all the victims are faceless and nameless. For example, the opening attack on page 1 starts with, quote, "the young thug." And there's mention of, quote, "two other thugs." And then the victim is, quote, "the boy." Even in the third paragraph, where we get the boy's internal monologue, where he's praying to God for help, it's a generic prayer, right? So what he says is, "Oh God, please help. I'll do anything if you only just come to my aid. I can't take any more of this torment." Okay, that's fine as far as it goes, but I think it's a missed opportunity to reveal something about this character. It's so generic that it doesn't resonate with the reader. We just sort of scan over it and move on. We don't learn anything about this victim. And if this was the inciting incident, for example, of the whole story, and we got to know something about the victim through this little prayer, now when the boy dies, we're outraged. We are angry that this person, maybe the boy, it's just him and his grandmother, and his grandmother relies on him to look after her. Now the boy's dead, and so what's happened to grandma now? Who's going to look after grandma? Who knows? Something there that establishes empathy with the victim, so that when the victim dies, we are outraged. And George R.R. Martin does this in Game of Thrones. I am still angry that the Sean Bean character died. Right? I wanted justice. Because I love Sean Bean and I loved that character, and I wanted justice, right? And so that's what happens when we empathize with the victim. We want justice, and then we are also empathizing with your main character. We really want him to succeed. We are now invested in this plot. All right. Let's see. What else do I have? I'm just looking at my notes. What else do I have here? Oh, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say is, with storytelling, the bigger the issue is that you want to tackle, the more specific the examples in your story must be. Let me give you an example of this in real life. There is a famous photograph known as, I don't know what the proper name of it is, but it's sort of just generally known in society as Napalm Girl. If you don't know what it is, just Google it. It was taken during the Vietnam War, and it's a black and white photo, and it's of a little girl running naked down the middle of the road, and she is crying in absolute terror. The story the photographer is telling there is about the horrors of war, which is a huge topic. But he told it using the image of one specific little girl in one specific Vietnamese village. This novel opens with citywide destruction, and it's very general. We don't know any of the details. Like, for example, who is the boy? Who are the journalists? Who are the dead victims in the park? Again, if you open with the specific attack of the global inciting incident, which is the one that you mentioned in the query letter, then it can be emblematic of the bigger issue of the terrorist attacks on the city. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I've been going on for quite some time. And Kathleen, I want to make sure you have plenty of time to share your thoughts with us. So what advice do you have for Charles about his opening pages?
Just a quick reminder to our listeners that my opinions and recommendations are my own and are not reflective of other agents or the Rights Factory. I didn't mention that before. So for me, I'm also wondering if we're starting the story out the right way. I Omniscient narration is not my personal favorite because it is very, very challenging to do well. And so I do see a lot of that where we're just head hopping here and there and everywhere, and we get all kinds of different viewpoints, and it can be confusing. So these opening pages, we do jump around a bit. We get some backstory, some exposition. There's several things happening that make the flow feel kind of off to me. So by the time I got to the 10th page, I'm still wondering when we're going to meet Akira, the protagonist. I still think he's the protagonist because that's what you have in a police procedural, but um, maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong and it's just not being pitched the right way. Even still, we've jumped from the perspective of the little boy. Like we start with the little boy, and then we have this kind of omniscient narration happening. Um, but yeah, there's not a lot of specificity or emotionality. I picked up on that as well when the boy has his saying his prayer. It just seemed kind of flat. Like it, there needs to be some emotion there, so that we can connect. But then I'm thinking like if starting the story in this place, if this little boy is not the protagonist and doesn't play, excuse me, and doesn't play a big role in the story, then why are we opening with something other than the protagonist point of view or the antagonist? Because we can have that as well. Um, but I don't think this little boy is either one of them. So having it from the perspective of the victim of what I assume are the four antagonists instead of the antagonist, or that it's happened already and Akira comes to the scene and this is from we experienced it through his eyes. So yeah, I don't know if we're starting in the right place, or using the right perspective, and so I'm wondering whose story is this, and then that brings me back to like, is it being pitched in the right way? um the opening pages focus on a boy being beaten up by some bullies, some thugs, a little bit older than him, but still young. And then out of nowhere, someone kills the bullies, like some kind of vigilante, right? Maybe. The police are on the scene, people want answers, then it jumps to something seemingly completely unrelated. A bomb goes off somewhere else in the city, and then another bomb goes off. So it felt a little disorienting to me because I don't know what happened to the boy. I don't know what happened with that investigation. I don't know if Akira is going to be focusing on the boy and those thugs or focusing on the bombs. Like, I just didn't know what was happening. And then it just seemed to drop off. And then we switch to someone who's not the boy, and the scene totally changes. So it almost makes like it seems like the situation with the boy doesn't matter because we kind of drop away from it. So then I'm left wondering if his personal situation doesn't matter. Why again did we open with the scene from his perspective? Um, I gather that what's happening is the killer of the bullies and the two bombs that went off, they're all done by these four men. I might be wrong. The bully killing I can see, but why target the buildings? Or the opposite, right? I'm not sure what their motivation would be for that other than just to cause damage to the city. But then why the city if it's just a corporation that they got fired from? And then why move on to killing people? Like it just doesn't seem to add up for me. I'm also still having a really hard time believing that not just one, but four grown men with wives at home, they have families, would all just decide to commit suicide because they lost their jobs. It's it's making it seem like there's nothing else in their life that matters except for their jobs, and I'm having trouble believing that. So I'm, like, why can't they apply for other jobs? This sort of thing happens all the time, especially nowadays, positions becoming redundant and even people getting fired for one reason or another. Why would that one thing make them decide to commit suicide and leave their wives behind or whatever family situation they have? Committing suicide is a very deep personal decision, and it's often someone who genuinely feels like they have no way out, no way to feel happy. They can't make others happy. Um, and I haven't experienced that, so I can only speak too much, or I can't speak too much on that. But I'm not buying that all four of them would just to say we lost our job, so we're going to commit suicide. Um, so believability is a big factor for me in these pages. If you're writing fiction and something seems unbelievable, it's usually because there hasn't been enough of a setup um, ahead of time. So, for example, if a character is contemplating suicide, there needs to be a reason for that, and we need to know about it like ahead of time, and has to seem believable. Um, it can also be because it's just so wildly out there that, and it just doesn't fit what's happening, and it's the author might not realize that it's just not fitting in. Um, so if something doesn't feel believable to your readers, then you run the risk of losing their trust in you as the author, and they may put the book down. And that is the last thing that we want them to do, right? We want them to stick with us until the very last page. Um, so yeah, I agree with everything that you said, Valerie, and those are my additional main points.
Okay, so
Um,
what final advice then would you have for Charles?
yeah. So in terms of the query letter, work on bringing that word count down. I would not query until um, the page count, or sorry, the word count, the story itself has been edited, and it is in a position that would fit the traditional publishing standards. Add some comps and a bio paragraph, and flesh out your plot paragraphs with more details. And then I would consider starting your story from the perspective of the protagonist. And sometimes it doesn't have to start with the protagonist, but that's typically how it goes. The person that we first meet on the page is the one that we expect to spend the most time with and get emotionally connected to. So if we're spending time with someone and building an emotional connection with someone that turns out to not be the protagonist, then it can get confusing about who we're rooting for. Um, and then, yeah, just think about the feasibility of what is happening on the page.
I mean, I could just say ditto, I guess, for my final advice, because in my notes I have pretty much what you just said there. Charles, again, job number one, I think, is getting that manuscript down to the 80 to 100,000 word range. And to do that, focus on the main plot line, which, as far as I can tell from the query letter and your genre, the genre of your story, your main storyline is Akira's investigation of these 4 horrific events, finding out who did it, and bringing them to justice. Now, I am confident that in your existing manuscript, that's in there. So what you could do, for example, is pull out those scenes, see what you have, and any information that you have in your book that isn't directly related to that plot line, set it aside. You can use it for something else. You might discover that there's a whole other story there, a whole other book that you can craft from the stuff you cut out of this one. So it's not wasted words. They just might not be words that fit in this particular book. So I'm sure it's there. I have confidence in your ability to pare down your manuscript. So take a deep breath and dive in, and you can do it.
Okay, I think that wraps it up for this week. If you want us to review your query letter and the first 10 pages writing sample, go to storynerd.ca for all the details about how to submit. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. To get your free first 10 pages checklist, visit valeriefrancis.ca/checklist. And remember, once you're on the mailing list, you'll also get copies of the query letter and writing samples we discuss each episode. To find out more about my agent wish list or what services I offer as an editor, visit KathleenFoxAgent.com and FoxEditorial.com and learn writing and publishing tips and advice by going to my Substack, Literary Cats Keynotes. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.